mummy, when was the last time you noticed what Evie was wearing? Not the explosions, the monsters, and not Brendan Fraser's smile and swashbuckling looks. Because the film's costume designer was doing something very intentional with Evie's look. When we first meet Evie, she is a spectacled, book-hugging, buttoned-up, proper young British woman. Yet her thirst for knowledge and passion for Egyptology just bursts through the screen. Apparently Stephen Sommers, the director, actually wanted an American actor to play the part of Evie, and Rachel Weisz auditioned 5 times before she got the role, and it was actually mainly due to her chemistry with Brendan Fraser. The script described Evie as a rather uninteresting British girl. Eyeglasses, hair in a bun, long skirts, boring clothes. Your typical prudish nightmare. But we all know Weiss's portrayal of Evie was anything but that, and so much more. Yes, she wore clothing that was buttoned up and modest and had longer hem lengths, but she was absolutely not uninteresting and prudish. She is the clumsy librarian, we know that, and she is dismissed by her male boss while just trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field. But she was brought up inheriting her parents' love for Egypt and Egyptology. But there is one moment in the film that kind of gets glossed over, and it totally struck me as soon as I watched it, to the point where I actually had to rewind and rewatch it a couple of times with captions on to make sure I was hearing correctly. In the scene, she is sitting by the fire with Rick, Brendan Fraser, and she drunkenly mentions how proud she is to be a librarian. We all know the scene. It is a very quoted scene and hilarious. But then she goes on to say how much her father loved Egypt, so much so that he married an Egyptian woman. Evie is half Egyptian, and I think it's something that doesn't get spoken about enough in that film or in the subsequent films after that. So her ability to read and understand and speak ancient Egyptian is in her blood. It's her inheritance. It's not something she's trying to perform or some kind of weird Orientalist career in Egypt that was very common for that time. She was truly speaking, reading, and working in her heritage. Evie's arc in both the first and the second Mummy films isn't really about her love story with Rick. It's about a woman coming back to herself, her mother's land, and her own inheritance. And yes, Rachel Weisz is not Egyptian. We know that is a valid conversation about casting in a 1999 Hollywood film. Almost none of the Egyptian characters in the film are actually ethnically Egyptian. But what's interesting about the film is that it wrote that Egyptian heritage into Evie's story and character regardless. And the costume design is where we actually see this story play out more than it would in any scene or dialogue. In the scene where they're truly in the desert now, and Evie needs to dress accordingly, the buttoned up shirts and the long lengths and starchy stiff fabrics just aren't serving her purposes anymore. She's taken by the local Egyptian women and has a kind of makeover scene. She's redressed in a relatively sheer but flowy black long dress with a low neckline and an embellished black face veil. She's also wearing very dark kohl around her eyes, and her hair is loose and curling. You know the scene. Rick's jaw is on the floor and he's just absolutely entranced by her beauty. And funnily enough, her wearing this isn't some exotic kind of fever dream. It is actually her wearing something that is part of who she is, part of her inner landscape and her DNA that she's reconnecting with. This is her reconnecting with her mother and finding a piece of herself. And Rick can see that, and so naturally he falls in love with her. But the interesting thing about this particular look is the veil itself and the kohl around her eyes. Now, in ancient Egypt, there were many gods and goddesses, but there were 2 specific goddesses who were sisters, and that was Isis and Nephthys. And they were known as the 2 weavers. They essentially wove magic into cloth and even resurrected the dead. Now, I might be sounding a little bit woo-woo, but I feel like by her wearing this veil is that she's kind of resurrecting a part of herself, like her matrilineal inheritance. And I absolutely love that. Neith was another ancient Egyptian weaving goddess. She was a creator goddess and a patron of weaving, and she was said to reweave the world daily on her loom. Plutarch records an inscription that reads, "I am all that was and is and shall be, and no mortal hath ever me unveiled. Now, the kohl around her eyes. Hathor, the goddess of cosmetic art, was never considered vain or shallow. She knew that beauty and adornment was a sacred act, a way of connecting and an act of devotion. Clothing, embellishment, adornment, cosmetics, all these seemingly shallow and vain and trivial things were something sacred in ancient Egypt. They were a form of devotion and sacred connection to the goddesses. And this scene with Evie is her reconnecting with her mother through those sacred acts of devotion. Now, in The Mummy Returns, Evie and Rick are married, they have a son, Alex, and she's a mother, but something is happening to her. She's hallucinating, or at least she thinks she is. What's really happening is that her mind and her spirit are reconnecting to an ancestor through her mother's lineage. Past lives, old memories, remembering where to go in an underground expedition as if she was only there yesterday. And she's also suddenly able to hold her own in a sword fight with trained assassins when she's actually never done anything like that before. These are her powers and strengths and insights inherited from her mother's ancestral line. That goes all the way back to Nefertiri, the daughter of Seti I. Now I know what you're thinking. Did she just say Nefertiti wrong? These are two completely different women, even though they sound relatively similar. They were separated by a century, and the confusion is understandable because the names are so similar, but let me reintroduce them to you. Nefertiti, she's the famous one, the one with the iconic bust in the Berlin Museum, the elongated neck, the blue crown, the extraordinary bone structure. She lived around 1370 to 1330 BCE during the 18th dynasty. She was the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the pharaoh who caused one of the most dramatic religious revolutions in ancient history by replacing the entire Egyptian pantheon with the worship of a single sun disk called the Aten. Nefertiti was central to that revolution, and she appears in art as equal to her husband, making offerings to the Aten, depicted with the same power and authority as her partner. Now, there's serious scholarly debate about whether she actually ruled Egypt in her own right after Akhenaten's death, possibly under a different name, but she was extraordinary nonetheless. And she's the one most people know. Then there's Nefertari. Different woman, different dynasty, about a century later. The beloved great royal wife of Ramesses II, the most famous pharaoh of ancient Egypt, whose tomb in the Valley of the Queens is considered one of the most beautiful ever found. Its walls covered in paintings of her being guided through the afterlife by Isis herself. Her name means beautiful companion. And then there's Nefertiri. This is the character in The Mummy Returns, a fictional character, not a direct representation of either of the historical women I just described. In the film, Nefertiri is the daughter of the pharaoh Seti I, who was actually Ramesses II's father. So the film places her in the 19th dynasty, the same period as the real Nefertari, but she's her own invented character. The name is clearly a nod to both of the historical queens, close enough to kind of evoke them, but different enough to make her own person. So to be clear, Nefertiti is the 18th dynasty queen with the famous bust. Nefertari is the 19th dynasty queen with the beautiful tomb, and Nefertiri is the fictional character and daughter of Seti I, whose soul has been living in Evie's body for 3,000 years. In Evie's flashback, she's fighting Anck-su-namun. Now, Nefertiri was the daughter of the pharaoh, and Anck-su-namun was his mistress, but she was in love with Imhotep, as we know. Nefertiri was the legitimate royal daughter fighting against her father's lying, unfaithful mistress. Now, the sword fighting flashback scene. The first thing we witness isn't just the general splendor of ancient Egypt, but the clothing and adornment of the two women fighting. Metal collars and belts, kohl around their eyes, embellishment. It's all consistent with Isis and Nephthys iconography. This is what goddesses wore. And the mask that Evie's wearing, or Nefertiri's wearing, covers her face entirely. So you don't really know who's who in that fight scene until later on. Her identity is completely Egyptian, while she's fighting for her life and her family. Now, the contrast between British Evie and Egyptian Evie is stark and purposeful. British Evie is buttoned up, white and pale linens, long skirts, minimal makeup, super thin brows, which were actually quite on point for the 1920s, spectacles, and her hair is up. Egyptian Evie is wearing black, loose and flowing clothing, hair down and curling, jewelry, embellishments, metal belting, and the kohl around her eyes. And she's not assimilating to Egyptian style, she's remembering it. She's coming back to herself. And we see that in The Mummy Returns, when she's just wearing her everyday style. And that's, 10 or 11 years after the first movie takes place. Flowing clothing, metal belts, richer tones, loose and lowered necklines, textured fabrics, flowing hair, and that iconic kohl around her eyes. And the film ends with not a battle, but a choice. Anck-su-namun, when it comes to it, chooses to save herself and run instead of saving Imhotep. You know the scene where they're kind of dangling over the chasm with all the souls trying to grab at their feet? Rick and Imhotep are there, and both their partners or their wives are on the other side with all these falling rocks. And Evie decides to run and get Rick, even though he's telling her to go and save herself. And she doesn't. She chooses to save him while putting herself at risk. And Imhotep, this whole time, has been about his enduring love story with Anck-su-namun. And yet, when it comes down to it, she chooses herself and decides to flee. And there's this beautiful scene that was so heartbreaking where Imhotep, after Anck-su-namun runs away, and he looks at Rick and Evie, and he realizes that he actually was so wrong and he hadn't experienced true love. And what he's witnessing by seeing them two together was that is true love. And he doesn't have it, so he doesn't want to exist anymore. So he lets go and he sinks into the chasm of souls. So two women with the same rivalry across 3,000 years. One remembered who she was and stayed true to herself, and the other never did. And also, when did we decide that fashion and adornment is shallow or vain or trivial? It is a connection, a sacred connection to our lineage, our inheritance, and our female ancestors. It is power. If this resonated with you, the Goddess Project is where I'm currently going 6 layers deep in all sorts of conversations like this. I'll leave all the links below to my podcast, my Substack, and my Instagram. Thanks for watching.